Teal dear. Another day, and another piece of what can best be described as pseudoscience propaganda, telling us all that video gamers are sexist. But as usual, I'm going to go through the study and demonstrate to you why I consider this to be a piece of propaganda that is basically complete and utter pseudoscience. So this is a piece called Video Games Exposure and Sexism in a Representative Sample of Adolescents, and it's published in Frontiers in Psychology. For anyone who works in academia or is even cursorily aware of it, the name Frontiers in has probably already piqued your ears. But for those who are unaware of why that would be the case, I'll address that at the end of the video. For now, let's just run through the abstract. Research has indicated that many video games are saturated with stereotypes of women, and that these contents may cultivate sexism. The purpose of this study was to assess the relationship between video game exposure and sexism for the first time in a large and representative sample. Our aim was also to measure the strength of this association when two other significant and well-studied sources of sexism, television exposure and religiosity, were also included in a multivariate model. A representative sample of 13,520 French youth aged 11 to 19 years completed a survey measuring weekly video game and television exposure, religiosity, and sexist attitudes towards women. Controlling for gender and socio-economic level, results showed that video game exposure and religiosity were both related to sexism. Implications for these results for future research on sexism in video games are discussed. Well, that all sounds pretty damning, doesn't it? But as always, let's look at the provisional version that they've provided to Frontiers in. We'll go through it, and then I'll point out all of the problems with this so-called study. And as a quick note before doing this, I will be reading from the provisional version, since that seems to be the only version of this study which is available on Frontiers in Psychology. As a result, this version may not reflect the fully published version, since by the very nature of this being a provisional piece, it may be subject to change. So if you're going to reference this study or reference this video for anything that you want to use for your own research, then remember to check the actual text first to make sure that nothing has been amended between now and then. So, let's get into the meat of this, shall we? Oh boy, it's gonna be good. The media are a powerful socializing agent of the modern era. Video games represent one of the most popular forms of media entertainment around the world, with a global market of more than $90 billion in 2015. Part of the popularity may be due to the appeal of masculinity. Sales are highest in teen and mature games, with box art depicting non-central sexualized female characters. I'd just like to briefly address this point, somewhat as an aside. This is somewhat an indicative example of what you're going to be seeing throughout this study, taking things which have very reasonable explanations and extrapolating sexism into them. So we'll take this box art thing for instance. We know that when you consider every single person who plays some form of video game, there's basically no difference between the number of men and the number of women. However, the gender distribution throughout different kinds of video game is not equal. Women, as a video games market, are disproportionately represented in things such as mobile gaming apps, or things which are often termed casual gaming. Men tend to be more overrepresented in mature games and things which are generally deemed to be more hardcore gaming, more PC-focused or console-focused, first-person shooters, third-person shooters, things like that. Games which have more mature themes. So it's completely reasonable that mature games, having a larger audience of men, are more likely to have things on the box art that appeal more towards men. It is the result of a consumer trend, not the cause of a consumer trend. Moving on with the study, the depiction and value granted to women is biased in traditional forms of media such as children's books, magazines, and TV, and there is no obvious exception with new digital media. It has even been argued that some of the most blatantly sexist representations of women is found today in video games. However, while the proofs of biased depictions in video games showing women as passive beings, kidnapped princesses to rescue, or sex objects to win or to use are numerous and indisputably recorded, their effect on gamers' stereotypes of women remains debated, despite some preliminary experimental demonstrations. Just for fun, when it came to the claim of kidnapped princesses and sex objects, I decided to grab one of those citations and just go and have a little look at some of the evidence that supposedly proves this point, and I just went straight down the middle, not only by date but also by name here, to Dill and Thill, 2007. And this led me to a study, Video Game Characters and the Socialization of Gender Roles. Young People's Perceptions Mirror Sexist Media Depictions. And reading the abstract indicates to us that this study is not showing what the author of this study tells us. The abstract reads, video game characters are icons in youth popular culture, but research on their role in gender socializations is rare. A content analysis of images of video game characters from top-selling American gaming magazines... Oh dear, let me just stop you right there. Video game magazines are not video games. They are, in fact, a completely different product. Now, they decided to gather all of their information from the top 5 video game magazines bought off of Amazon.com. And when they looked at the demographics of the people who subscribed to this, 93% of them were male. Color me surprised that something with a 90-something% male viewer base would be more likely to have some sort of sexualized appearance of women. And just because they are video game magazines, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are covering every kind of video game that exists. They have a 90-something% male viewer base, so they're probably tailoring their selection of what they show in their magazine majoritarily to men. And here's a shocker, men like attractive women. If these video games did nothing but review children's games for the Nintendo Wii, they probably wouldn't be the top 5 selling video game magazines, would they? So this was just me grabbing a random citation that they've got to support this point, and it doesn't actually support the point at all. What a surprise. The present study used a large representative sample of adolescents to analyze the link between video game exposure and the endorsement of sexist attitudes towards women. We also compare this link to 2 other consequential and well-studied influences on sexist attitudes. The first is television exposure, which has been shown as a major factor involved in sexist depictions of females. The other important factor is religiosity, which has a significant influence on stereotyped gender role beliefs. The introduction of these influential additional determinants of sexism will provide us with the opportunity to have a more precise and embedded view of the specific relationship between video games exposure and sexism among adolescents. So this is important because these people want to study how sexist video games make you, and to do so they're going to be comparing it to television and religion. In fact, a little bit later in this study, they even state, in the present study, we are interested in the links between video games and sexist attitudes, and we focused on the largest sample gathered to date on video games and sexism. So this study is all about linking video games to sexist attitudes, and I want you to remember that because that fact is so important when it comes to the methodology of how they've worked out what sexism is and what sexism isn't. And before we get into the results section, I'm just going to read a fairly large section of this study which demonstrates how contentious this idea is. According to Bandura's social cognitive theory, symbolic representations of the world are learned through exposure to models. People rely on such acquired knowledge structures to perceive others and interact with them. Developments in media psychology suggest that the digital representation of the female body is not a mere innocent succession of entertaining polychromatic polygons on a screen, but can change users' attitudes and behaviors off-screen. Previous theoretical developments suggest that users learn long-term schemas about gender, and that such schemas influence everyday interactions in potentially detrimental ways for women. According to the cultivation theory, repeated exposure to media content influences how social realities are perceived and understood. Adolescents who play video games may model beliefs about gender roles on the distorted reality presented in video games. Relevant to the present study, given that a high percentage of video games include sexist and even misogynistic portrayals of females, we hypothesize that more spent time playing video games should predict higher sexist attitudes. I notice that there is no citation for the high percentage of video games that include sexist and misogynistic portrayals of females. It is merely an assertion. Because video games are designed for iterative play, potentially more than 100 hours for more developed products, and are inherently interactive, they enable repeated and distributed learning about gender roles that may have enduring effects. Video game characters can be agents of gender socialization among youth, and the amount of exposure to video games should predict the endorsement of gender stereotypes. Some studies have supported this prediction, which implies that some have not. Several experimental studies showed the short-term effect of sexualized video games on sexist attitudes. These studies showed that playing sexualized video games for a few minutes, 10 to 20, promotes men's likelihood to endorse gender stereotypes, increases hostile sexism, and increases men's acceptance of sexual harassment. Fewer studies have been interested in long-term links between video games and sexist attitudes. In one cross-sectional study, it was shown that men who regularly played video games with sexist content, according to their own evaluation of sexism, tended to have a higher level of benevolent sexism that is associated with perceptions of rigid gender roles and is characterized by protective, patronizing attitudes towards women. However, a longitudinal study examining the influence of video game exposure on sexist beliefs and attitudes over a 3-year period found no evidence of a cultivational effect. Further cross-sectional and longitudinal studies are therefore necessary. Did you notice the massive number of weasel words in what you've just read? Everything may do something, it could do something, it might do something, and there is no consensus on whether or not it actually does. And in fact, as the authors admit here, when it comes to long-term studies, there is no indication that it has any negative effect whatsoever, which to my mind puts this squarely in the same category as those studies that show video games increase levels of violence, where if you actually look at the studies and what they're showing, when people play video games competitively, they tend to have an increased level of aggression temporarily, which comes down very, very rapidly. And in a lot of cases, that's simply indicative of a healthy and actually quite normal increase in level of aggression when taking part in some sort of competitive activity, and is in no way related to some sort of long-term effect or change on their behavior. Also notice how in this study we're dealing with people who believe that benevolent sexism is a thing. Now the problem with this is the idea of hostile sexism or benevolent sexism becomes a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. If you don't hold a door open for a woman, you could be scored high on hostile sexism because you clearly only didn't hold the door open because she's a woman. If you do hold the door open for a woman, you score high on benevolent sexism because you think that as a woman she is incapable of doing it for herself, and that means you hate women. It is such a horrendously interpretivist way of looking at things that it basically becomes completely worthless. This is straight out the playbook of feminist theory, or as I term it, feminist assertion, because it in no way meets the criteria for being considered a scientific theory. It is not measurable in any capacity whatsoever. It is not repeatable, and the model is in no way predictive. You cannot take a formula and predict if a man holding a door open is going to be sexist or not. It is entirely down to circumstance and someone's interpretivist reading of what's going on in the situation. But let's get on into the methodology of the study, shall we? Because all of the problems which I've pointed out thus far are fairly minor compared to the method and the results. The sample included 13,520 participants aged 11 to 19, who were selected at school through stratified random sampling and is representative of the metropolitan areas of Grenoble and Lyon, France. These two cities are the major municipalities of the second largest and wealthiest region of France. The sample population corresponds to urban France in terms of age, sex, and school level. Students completed paper questionnaires in their classrooms. An assistant was present in the room and helped the participants upon request. The participation rate was slightly above 95%. After this, there's the mandatory part about how they differentiated between public and private schools and how they got all sorts of levels of education and so on and so forth. All pretty standard stuff. And there's also the ethics statements, which I'm not going to bother reading because they're pointless for this video, but just something which studies have to have. All the measures were extracted from a larger survey based on the ISRD2 questionnaire. Gender was coded as male, 1, 50.7%, or female 2, 49.1%. Participants' ages ranged from 11 to 19 with a median of 14.5. As with other studies, father's educational level was used as a proxy for socio-economic status and was distributed into the following categories: no degree, lower than baccalaureate, holds a baccalaureate, and higher than a baccalaureate. Albeit less than optimal, such a measure enables an approximation of socioeconomic status that is less subjected to biases or missing values than other estimations in the context of a school survey. I agree that this is a less than optimal way of doing it, but I would go much further and say that that is an absolutely terrible way of measuring someone's socioeconomic status. Firstly, because level of education is not a direct one-to-one for socioeconomic status. Yes, there is correlation, but it's not an absolutely perfect one. Second of all, children tend to have more than one parent, and it's actually quite common now for households to have two working parents, both the mother and the father. Removing the mother from the equation and just saying that women have absolutely no effect on the socioeconomic status of a child is ridiculous. And it's made even more ridiculous because, if France is anything like the rest of the Western world, they may also be currently enjoying the trend where women are graduating from universities at higher rates than men, and yet later on in their lives dropping out of the job market in order to have children and become full-time parents. At which point their level of education is in no way connected to their socioeconomic status whatsoever. All round, this is just an absolutely god-awful way of doing this, and you should be ashamed of yourselves. But that's nothing compared to what's coming up next. Media exposure was assessed by the following question: how many hours per day did you spend on average last week, Monday to Friday, playing computer or video game consoles? And how many hours per day did you spend on average last week, Monday to Friday, watching TV, DVDs, or films, including on the internet? In order to ensure an appropriate distribution of the variables, we created 10 categories from 1 hour per day to 10 hours per day or more. According to their estimations, participants spent 2.77 hours per day watching TV and 1.7 hours per day playing video games. Although this measure cannot estimate the quantity of sexist content adolescents were exposed to in video games and on television, women are frequently portrayed in sexist ways. Time exposure to TV and video games may, therefore, be considered an acceptable proxy for general exposure to sexist contents. So you have absolutely no control when it comes to actually ascertaining what it is that they're watching. You're just assuming that they're all watching sexist content because you think that there is a load of sexist and misogynistic content out there. You're just assuming that they're watching this stuff because, well, it's kind of likely that it could be. Never mind that you could quite easily sit down and watch 2 hours of stuff which has absolutely no sexist content in it whatsoever, but you're just going to assume that that's the case. You couldn't even be bothered to get the kids to write down the titles of the TV shows that they were watching or the titles of the video game that they played. Oh, what's that? You sat and played a crossword puzzle game for half an hour every night before you went to bed? Clearly sexist content! This is an absolute joke. This is absolutely awful. I cannot overemphasize how bad of a mistake this is in the method of this paper. Oh, but it gets better. Religiosity. 2 measures of religiosity were included. Religious attendance was assessed by asking respondents to report the frequency they attended religious services from never, 1, to every day, 6. The denominations were Catholics 27.4, Muslims 25.9, Protestant 1.9, Jews 0.9, Christian Orthodox 0.7, Anglican 0.1, and other 3.8. Moreover, 39.4% declared no religion. Religious salience was measured on a 4-point scale of how important religion is in participants' everyday life, ranging from not at all important 1 to very important 4. The 2 measures being strongly related, we constructed a composite measure. Now let me just stop you right there. This is a representative sample of the French population, correct? Well, I've got a few questions about that. Conducting a census in France which discriminates based on religion has been illegal for a number of decades now. But that law does not extend to surveys being performed by outside organizations. So let's take a little look at the CIA's World Factbook about the religious demographics of France. Christian, overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, 63 to 66%. Muslim, 7 to 9%. Buddhist and Jewish, both 0.5 to 0.75%. Other, 0.5 to 1%. And no religion reported, 23 to 28%. So the numbers in this study don't really seem to be very representative at all, unless France has undergone a massive demographic shift of young people, which, given the ridiculous rates of immigration into France over the past few years, is actually a possibility. But I do question just how exactly representative this sample is when it comes to religion, because it does seem like it could be representative of large cities, which is where most migrants tend to go, but that means that it's in no way representative of the larger country. But that is a very minor concern compared to what is about to come. Remember how the authors of this study specifically said, "We were interested in the links between video games and sexist attitudes." So how did they determine whether or not someone was being sexist? Clearly they must have a very robust barrage of questions to determine the level of sexism of the participants. Well, let's have a look. Sexism. Sexism was measured with a single item question. Participants were asked the following Likert-type question. Quote, "A woman is made mainly for making and raising children," end quote, from fully disagree 1 to fully agree 4. Sexism is the main thing that you are testing for, and you ask a single question. A single poorly worded question. A woman is made mainly for making and raising children. Biologically, a woman is made for making children. They have a womb, the thing that you need in order to gestate a child. Biologically, a woman absolutely is made for the making of children. It is an evolutionary fact. So the main thing that you are looking for in this study, you have determined via one question that is ambiguously worded at best. Frankly, I have no words for this level of incompetence. And the icing on the cake is in the discussion section addressing this fact. They even say, it should also be mentioned that the use of a single item scale to assess sexism was less than optimal. This item was actually the only measure of sexism in the ISRD2 survey and represents a very specific dimension of sexism, motherhood or domesticity, that hardly captures all possible forms of sexist thinking. So according to the authors, the actual problem wasn't that they used a terrible means of assessing sexism. The actual problem is that they might not have been able to declare the participants as being sexist enough. You knew that this was a flaw of the ISRD2 survey, so why did you use it? Why are you using tools which are not fit for purpose when you are designing your study? Don't bother answering that, because I know what the answer is. You knew the outcome that you wanted to get, and so this is how you went about getting it. And then you can just hand-wave away at the end of the study, "Oh, well, we know that we did it in a really ridiculous way, but lol, doesn't matter, I still get to publish something." And the worst part is, this study is going to be cited. It is going to be used by people as proof that video games cause sexism, when this study is garbage. And the other funny thing is, the authors of this study are clearly so aware of how flawed this methodology is that also in the discussion section they say, of course, the usual critiques aimed at cross-sectional surveys fully apply here, particularly the limitations in terms of assessing causality. It may be that individuals with sexist orientations spend more time playing video games. So basically, this study, as with so many like it, does not in any way demonstrate a causal link from the activity to the attitude. And that's the problem with cultivation theory in general. And I'll give you an example of this. Let's say that in an area of very high crime, you survey people about the amount of time that they spend watching television, and you then find that there is a large amount of television being watched in this high crime area. These people would basically just say, oh well, they watch a lot of television, clearly television is related to the high crime. When in fact the reason that people are watching a lot of TV is because they don't want to go outside because they live in a high crime area. They would rather stay at home so they don't go outside risking being attacked, and they would rather stay at home to protect their personal belongings. TV is not the cause of the crime, the watching TV is caused by the higher rates of crime. It's not a causal link at all. And this study, if you want to call it that, suffers from the same sorts of flaw. It has demonstrated no causal link between these things whatsoever. And once again, I'm going to say it, it will be cited as if it has proved something, which it hasn't. While we're talking about terrible research being cited as if it proved something when it hasn't, I laughed so hard when I read this part of the discussion. Interestingly, participants with a higher socioeconomic level endorsed less sexism. This is consistent with a behavioral study carried out in an online first-person shooter video game, showing that low-status players were more hostile toward a female teammate, while high-status players were more positive towards her. And the citation for that is Kasiimovic and Kuznikov 2015. Those names may ring some bells for those of you in my audience who have been subscribed to me for a long time. That is the study which spawned all of the "sexist video gamers are losers" articles. That study was in no way related to socioeconomic level at all. It was related to in-game status, which was ascertained using a kill-death ratio in Halo. That was the study which desperately tried to prove that sexism was rampant in online video games by desperately massaging their statistics. You may well recall in my video on the subject, when looking at the raw data, you actually find that 80% of people you encounter online will never even talk to you, and that less than 1% of all online interactions could be deemed as sexist. In that specific study, they found 7 instances out of however many hundred that they recorded, and given the small player base in the Halo game that they were testing, that could have all quite easily come from 1 or 2 people. That was also the study where they compared male and female iterations playing the game, without a control which didn't speak, and the male iteration consistently outperformed the female iteration. It was absolutely awful. And yet it's being cited here as if it proved something. A piece of pseudoscience nonsense citing another piece of pseudoscience nonsense. Oh, what a surprise! This is why the social so-called sciences are a joke. And speaking of things in the social so-called sciences being considered jokes, let's finally talk about the Frontiers In series, shall we? Frontiers In is a series of open-source journals which are basically considered a joke within the academic community. In fact, they have been blacklisted by numerous actual reputable organizations. Frontiers In had to retract a paper that claimed climate change denialism was associated with a more general tendency towards advocating conspiracy theories, which had to be retracted and resulted in the resignation of one of the editors. And there was another case where a Frontiers In journal published a paper that questioned whether or not HIV was linked to AIDS. Now, while these instances were not related to the Frontiers in Psychology part of the journal, it gives you an indication of the overall quality of editorial review and peer review that goes on at Frontiers in general. Not everything that's published there is complete and utter nonsense. Of course, there will be good and rigorous papers published there. However, this study is not one of them. And any organization that you find telling you that this study is in any way reputable, or referencing it as if it makes some sort of point, should be laughed out of whatever room they are in.